Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're going to talk about preparing to vote 201 and how to combat voting barriers for you and your community. I'm AJ Link. I'm a policy analyst at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and I'm joined by Greg Robinson.
Hi, I'm Greg Robinson. I am the Deputy Director of Public Policy for the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. Thank you for joining us today. As a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about today, we will be talking about two things in particular: barriers to voting. These are things that get in the way of voting, and they can include things such as disenfranchisement, which is when your ability to vote is taken away; procedural barriers, which are rules that make it harder to vote; gerrymandering, which is when the districts that you vote in are changed in ways that are unfair, and ballots that are very hard to understand. And then we'll talk about what you can do to prepare to vote and help others to vote. And that includes things like talking about voting, helping other people make plans, and helping people get to the polls. So I'll turn it back to AJ to start us off.
The first thing we're going to talk about is disenfranchisement. Disenfranchisement means not having the right to vote. In the US, all adults who are US citizens should have the right to vote. But there are a few ways states can disenfranchise someone from voting. We will talk about three of these ways. The first is guardianship, the second is incarceration, and the third is removal from voting rolls. Disenfranchisement through guardianship. Guardianship is a way of removing a person with disabilities' rights. When someone is under guardianship, they can lose a lot of their rights. This can include the right to vote. Different states have different rules about guardianship and voting rights. Some states say you cannot vote if you have a guardian. Some states say you cannot vote if you have a guardian, but only if a judge has ruled you cannot vote. Some states let you vote if you are under guardianship. You can find out more about your state's laws with ASAN's guide, Your Vote Counts, What Are the Laws in My State? If your right to vote has been taken away because you are under guardianship, contact your state's Protection and Advocacy Organization, or P&A. P&As are groups that help disabled people with legal issues, like the right to vote. Your state's P&A can help you find out if you can get your right to vote back. You can find your state's P&A in our guide, Your Vote Counts, What Are the Laws in My State? Disenfranchisement through incarceration. Incarceration means going to jail or prison after you are convicted of a crime. When someone is incarcerated, they may lose their right to vote. It depends on the type of crime they were convicted of and what state they live in. A misdemeanor is a smaller crime. An example of a misdemeanor would be stealing a jacket from a store. Felonies are bigger crimes. An example of a felony would be murdering someone. All states let you vote if you are waiting to go to trial for a crime, even if you are in jail or prison. Most states let you vote if you are incarcerated for a misdemeanor. You can still register to vote and ask for a mail or absentee ballot. Most states do not let you vote if you are incarcerated for a felony. You have to wait until you are out of jail or prison to re-register to vote. Some states also make you wait until you are off parole or probation to re-register to vote. In most states, once you have completed your incarceration, parole, and probation, you can automatically re-register to vote. In some states, you must ask the government, usually the governor's office, for permission to re-register to vote. You can find out more about your state's laws around registering to vote after incarceration from the U.S. Vote Foundation. If you need help registering to vote or figuring out if you can register to vote again, you can contact your state's P&A. Disenfranchisement through removing voters from rolls. Removing voters from the rolls. States and counties keep lists of who is registered to vote. Occasionally, they will go through the lists and remove people. This happens to remove names of people who have died, moved out of the state or county, or are no longer eligible to vote. But sometimes states or counties remove people who are still eligible to vote. This is called a voter purge. Often, when a voter purge happens, people who are removed from the list aren't told they were removed. They only find out when they go to vote and find out they are no longer registered to vote. You should always check your voter registration.
Okay, so I will talk a bit about procedural barriers now. Procedural barriers are rules about how to vote that make it harder for people to vote. Some examples of procedural barriers to voting include requirements to have certain types of identification, such as photo ID, the closing of certain places to vote and places to register to vote, the moving places to vote or register a vote farther away from where people live and where people are. Changing the hours that people can vote to make it harder for people to vote when they need to, and rules that create long waits to voting, which can include some of those other things we just talked about, including changing locations or changing hours. It also includes rules that might make it harder to vote by mail or that make in-person voting inaccessible to people. And then finally, it can also include not training election workers well enough, and causing election workers to not know what the law is or to not want to follow the law. And in those situations, that can also be a barrier to voting. So procedural barriers are also disenfranchised, but they are a bit different from the other examples we talked about because they don't remove your right to vote. They just make it much harder to actually use your right to vote. They make it harder for people to vote. They can make it harder for people to register to vote or to know the right way to vote. Or they can make it harder for you to make your vote count if you have to vote in a way that is less certain. One important thing to note is that a lot of times you will hear reasons for procedural barriers that are not necessarily true. And I think this is something we do want to be very clear about. A lot of procedural barriers make it hard for certain groups of people to vote than others. And many times that is on purpose. And often the purpose of procedural barriers is to keep some groups of people from voting. And I think it's important that when we talk about them, we also recognize that and say that that's wrong. So next we can talk about, I'll turn it back to AJ to talk about gerrymandering.
Gerrymandering happens when a political group tries to change a voting district to get more votes for themselves or to make sure a different group gets less votes. An example is there are two political parties in an election, Party A and Party B. Party A currently controls the government. Party A does not want Party B to control the government. There is a voting district where Party A will get 40 votes and Party B will get 50 votes. Party A does not want to lose this voting district to Party B. So Party A redraws the voting districts. In the new voting district, Party A will get 40 votes, but Party B will only get 30 votes. Gerrymandering might mean that your polling place might change without much notice. Gerrymandering means that you might be in a different voting district than the last election, and gerrymandering is bad. It confuses voters and makes it harder for people to vote. Political parties shouldn't gerrymander. On this slide, we have an example of gerrymandering. There are 3 different ways to divide the 50 people into 5 districts. The first picture shows the 50 people where there are 60% blue and 40% red. The next picture shows perfect representation, where there are 3 blue districts and 2 red districts. The blue districts win. The second example is a compact but unfair district. It creates 5 blue districts and 0 red districts, and blue wins. The third example is neither compact nor fair. It creates 2 blue districts and 3 red districts, and the red districts would win.
Okay, so finally, we're going to discuss complex ballots, which are another way that people can, another barrier to voting. But I think in this case, unlike many of the examples that we listed before, they're things that they make voting less accessible, and we are going to discuss that. Sometimes this is for reasons that are well intended, so I think it's worth acknowledging that. One is one involves referendums. One reason ballots can be complicated is that a lot of things can be part of an election, and one of them that we discussed in the previous webinar was referenda. Referendums are when the entire community votes on whether a law should on a law. It's usually a yes or no question. It's sometimes called a ballot measure, a ballot question, or a proposition. They're usually asking very specific questions, very specific laws, but sometimes they're really not worded in a way that's easy to understand. And that is a place where sometimes you will find questions that are worded in a way that is intentionally confusing. So, but and that's one reason it can be very important to do your research before getting to the polls, to figure out what's on the ballot, and to make a decision about how you want to vote before you get to the polls. So some ways you can do that include sample ballots, which are available on a number of sites. Many states will also post sample ballots before an election, but there's also Ballotpedia's sample ballot tool. We can share those links as well. So the next the next example of ranked choice voting, of complex ballots, is ranked choice voting. And this is another one where the intent is to make voting more democratic, but it does also make it more confusing. So it is worth discussing that. In the United States right now, most elections are single choice voting. That's where you only vote for one candidate for each race. For example, if there's 3 candidates for president, you only get to vote for one. I will also say you will find some state and local races where there's slate voting, which is when you select it. They might say there's 5 candidates, select 3. And in that case, you just select the 3 that you want from the 5 who are running. Those you will see sometimes in state and local races, but the most complex example, though, is ranked choice voting, which is a different way of voting from single choice. The idea for ranked choice voting is for each race you get to choose multiple candidates, usually 3. You choose your top 3 candidate. You mark which one is your first choice, which one is your second choice, and which one is your third choice. And the way that works is, if they typically it can be a little different from depending on how each place uses it, but what typically happens is they see who won the race. If nobody has most of the votes, then the person who got the lowest votes, everyone who voted for them, their second choice is where their vote gets put. So the idea is, if you don't get your first choice, your second choice is who you voted for. Some states, cities, and counties are now using ranked choice voting. If your voting district uses ranked choice voting, your ballot may look different from what you're used to. And a few tips we have to help learn how to make a ranked choice ballot. One is to look at a sample ballot. Many states will let you download a sample ballot to fill it out before you get to your real ballot in the election. You can ask a poll worker to help you. When you're at the polling place, you can get help from a worker there who can help you vote. You can also check out some of the resources we have on ranked choice voting, including Ballotpedia, the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, and Fair Vote. We are also planning in the future to make more resources around ranked choice voting so that it's easier to understand the way to vote in these situations. So as an example of ranked choice voting, there's 3 candidates. There's John Smith, Jane Doe, Henry Kin, all running for mayor. None of them receive a majority of the first choice votes. John Smith receives the fewest first choice votes, so he's taken out of the race. All the second choice votes from him go to from everyone who chose John Smith are counted instead. That gives Jane Doe enough votes to win the election, so in that she would win. So now let's talk a bit about how you can help people vote and get past these barriers, because we talked a lot about some of the problems you might encounter when voting, but let's talk about what we can do about it. So one important thing that all of us can do is helping other people vote. There are a lot of ways you can help people voting. You can talk about voting, you can help people make plans to vote, and you can help people get to the polls. So for talking about voting, you can talk about why voting is important. In our previous webinar, we talked a lot about reasons why it is important to vote. Those include the fact that voting lets us have a say in the government. Voting lets us show what's important to us. Voting can help us make or pass laws that we want to pass, especially when there's a referendum, as we mentioned. And the other important thing is that for a lot of our history, disabled people have been disenfranchised, as have racial minorities and women. And if you can vote, it's good to vote. It's a civil right. It's something that we haven't always had it's a right we haven't always had recognized, and it's something that we fought for. And voting is a way to make sure we keep that right. So that is another reason why we should vote. Other things you can do are share your plan to vote, and you can help ask and answer questions people might have about voting. All right, so next slide and next slide. I think we're okay. And so we talked a bit about making a plan. I did want to talk about what you should be planning, what's important, what you'll need when you go vote. It can also help other people make their plans. The first step is making sure that you're registered to vote. Different states have different deadlines. It is important to know what those deadlines are. States should have a webpage that lets you know. There are also some of the resources that we can share here will also let you know what your state's deadline is, so you can make sure that you're registered to vote before the election. You should also check to see if you need any ID or paperwork. That was one of those procedural barriers we talked about. But if you can prepare and make sure that you have whatever you need to vote, then you can bring that with you, and that's really important as well. Next thing is, if you are going to vote by mail, which is an option available in many states, it's important to request a ballot to make sure that you receive that ballot in time to get it to send it back. Another option that exists in a lot of places is to use a Dropbox, which, if you're worried about the time, if that's available to you, you can go to a Dropbox location. If you're using a Dropbox or voting in person, it's important to find the location of the polling place or the Dropbox, and to make a plan to get to that place. Like we mentioned, one other procedural barrier that sometimes exists is changes to where polling places are or moving them to difficult to get to access places. So having a plan to get there is a really important step there. And then the last two things are to check the sample ballot so that you know what to expect when you vote. And then to take some time to think about and decide how you're voting, which can involve talking to other people, doing research, figuring out how you feel about an issue or a candidate, and deciding who to vote for or what to vote on a referendum. And that means there's no surprises when you get to the polls because you already know what you're doing. So for helping other people make plans, you can help people make plans to vote. Like we just said, there's the steps that we just went through. You can share your plan to vote, and you can ask questions that can help people make those plans. Are you registered to vote? Do you need help registering to vote? Do you know who you're voting for, or do you know what you're voting on? And I do want to note there, it's okay to ask that. It's also important to make sure that people are able to make choices for themselves. Do not tell people how to vote, but you can ask people if they know what they're voting for, if they know what's on the ballot, and if they have questions about voting or how to make decisions, you can share how you did that, and that can be very helpful. You can ask people if they need help getting to the polls or getting a mail-in ballot. And you can ask if there's anything that you can help with. So helping other people get to the polls. Like we said, you can make a plan for how you will get to the polling place. If you know other people are going to the same polling place, you can make a plan with them, and that can make it easier to travel sometimes. Ways that can get to the polling place, if it's close enough, you may be able to walk. You can drive or take a carpool if there's a number of you going to the same place. You can take a bus or a train, or you can take a taxi. You can also see if mail options are available in your state, and if those work better for you. If the polling place isn't very accessible, that may be another option you can look at. The important thing to remember is to stick to your plan on election day and to use that plan to get to the polling place. So then lastly, we want to talk about another important part of making a plan, and that is what to do if someone keeps you from voting. We talked a lot about some of the barriers that might experience that can happen, and we want to let people know that there are things that they can do when you have a problem at the poll. First off, if someone directly stops you from voting, if they threaten you, if they block you, if they try to keep you from voting, or if you're in the polling place and they try to tell you who to vote for, the first thing you should do is tell a poll worker. And the second thing is there's an election protection hotline, which is 866-R-VOTE or 866-687-8683. We will have another slide with that number. That is the election protection hotline. It is run by legal experts who work to protect our elections and will take your issue seriously and help you resolve it. Next question. If you aren't able to vote because the polling place won't accommodate your disability, it's very similar. Tell a poll worker, call the election protection hotline. You can also talk to your PNA when that happens. They should be able to also assist you in dealing with the problem. And then the other option is the other thing you should do is file an ADA complaint in that case. And we have the URL here for the ADA complaint line. So the next question, what if someone gives you election materials in a language you don't understand very well. So there's a few things you can do here. First, if you think that might happen, you can have a person come with you to help you vote. As long as that person isn't someone you isn't, as long as that person isn't your boss or someone who works for your boss or someone who works for the union you work for, that person can go with you into the polls, can read questions to you, can help you fill out your ballot. That is a right you have. That is the law. The reason it can't be those people is they want to make sure that it isn't your boss making you vote a certain way. But as you can have a friend or a family or someone else come with you to assist you with the voting. The other thing is, for a lot of languages, polling places are required to give translation. If it's a language that a certain number of people in your community speak, there's a law that requires them to have translated materials for you. If neither of those things happen, if the poll worker doesn't do that, or if you need more help for any other reason, you can call the voter protection line. And we have a number of numbers for different languages listed here. There's the one in English that I listed before, that's 866-R-VOTE. There's the Spanish language line is 1-888-VE-VOTA. That's 888-839-8682. Arabic is 844-YALA-US. That is 844-925-5287. And then for Bengali, Cantonese, Hindu, Urdu, Korean, Mandarin, Tagalog, or Vietnamese, you can call 1-888-API-VOTE. That's 1-888-274-8683. And we can share those in chat as well. And then finally, and this is an important one, this is one of the ones that is most likely to is more common and can happen. If a poll worker says that you aren't registered to vote, or you don't have the right paperwork or ID, or for some other reason you're not eligible to vote, there's a couple of things you can do here. One is, some states will let you register to vote the same day you vote. It is still better to register beforehand, because you may not know for sure that that's true in your state, and you may have other issues if you try. But if that will fix the problem, you should do that. If you can register and vote the same day because you weren't registered, that will fix the problem with you're having at the poll, you should definitely do that. If you can't do that, the other option is to request a provisional ballot. Provisional ballots are special ballots that are there to make sure that if there is a paperwork problem like this, you can still vote, but it does mean that they're going to take a little longer because they have to check to make sure the paperwork problem is fixed before they can count your vote. So polling places are required to offer provisional ballots for people who have problems at the polls like this. But they do hold on to it until they can fix the problem, and that they may have to ask you additional questions. It takes a little bit longer, and it's not as guaranteed. So in that case, that's sort of the last resort. If you can vote the normal way, that's better. But if the polling place will not give you a provisional ballot, and you can't register the same day, it's important to call the election hotline again, because that is also the law. They are supposed to give you a provisional ballot, that they're supposed to be able to offer you one. And if they don't, then you should call the election protection hotline and someone can help you. And that is what we have. Thank you everyone who for coming and listening. We can take some questions, and mostly we just encourage everyone to vote. And as we said, it's an important right that we all worked very hard for, and it's important that we exercise it.
Thank you so much. Like Greg said, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I also wanted to take a second to highlight, this is the end of our voting webinar series, but we do have a webinar on November 8th about voting. If you want to talk about that, Greg, give folks time to put questions in the chat.
Sure. Yeah. So the ASEN Gala is coming up, and we are going to be having a section where people talk about their voting experience, talk about it'll be a little bit later. So for some people, it'll be after they voted, but we welcome people to join for that. That was Dean, if you can help me out, I believe that was November 8th.
Yeah, no problem. It's
Yeah.
Tuesday, November 8th. The panel is As If Your Life Depends on It, and they'll cover voting in the disability community. That'll be November 8th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. That'll be moderated by ASEN's November Res, and it'll talk about disability advocates, the work that they've done to ensure our communities can vote, and we'll cover what barriers exist for our community and others when it comes to voting, and the work that the panelists are doing locally and nationally to combat those barriers. So one question for you, Greg and AJ. What can we do to combat gerrymandering in our communities if we know that that's an issue?
So one very important thing is gerrymandering is something that is done by state elected officials. So it is very important to pay attention to your state races, your state House representatives, your state senators, your governor. When you're voting, it's important to make those decisions, knowing that they will be the ones who help make those maps. Another important thing that's also part of this is we just passed the decennial census. That's once every 10 years. The census also is part of what counts people to determine how many people live where, and that's an important part of the redistricting process. So the next one isn't until 2030, but it's important to participate in the census for that reason. It has a huge impact on how and when gerrymandering happens. And the other thing is a lot of this is that there are a lot of legal cases around gerrymandering and representation, and there are not often as many opportunities to directly make your voice heard, but you can definitely make sure that people know about that and that people are paying attention to what the laws that are being passed say about protecting your rights. And then the last thing is there is federal legislation that is looking at ways to protect voters and make sure that our rights are protected in that districting process. So we will often raise those issues when those laws are being proposed, so continue to watch this space, and we will and we can help you find those opportunities. AJ, is there anything that you want to add?
This is AJ. I would just add that there are also things called independent redistricting committees or commissions. And those are something that you should look into, and maybe that would be helpful and beneficial in the redistricting process in your state.
Yes, and you can write to your elected officials and tell them that you want that, and that can make sure that the main problem with gerrymandering, which is that the people who have power right now want to keep it, and they want to change their districts to make sure they can keep power. If you make your voice heard, then then your elected officials will take that seriously. So.
Thank you so much. If there are any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, Greg, I think we're all right to wrap up.
Again, thank you everybody for coming. And please take the time to vote if you're able to. Thank you.